Welcome to the Close the Chapter podcast. I am Kristen Boyce, a licensed marriage and family therapist with a private practice, Pathways to Healing Counseling. Through conversations, education, strategies, and shared stories, we will be closing the chapter on all the thoughts, feelings, people, and circumstances that don't serve you anymore and open the door to possibilities and the real you. You won't want to miss an episode, so be sure to subscribe. Welcome to this week's Close the Chapter podcast. You came to the right place. If you struggle with emotional eating, and I know many people do, this is the episode for you. You've come to the right place. I am so grateful you're here. If you are on a healing journey of any kind, this is the community for you. You are not alone. You matter. You're important. You're loved. And I don't want you to do this alone. And may this podcast be a source of support, compassion, growth, and community. So that's why you're here and you found us somehow. Maybe you're a client. Maybe you are in therapy and found this podcast. Maybe you just stumbled upon it or someone shared it with you. You belong here. So thank you for showing up, engaging, listening to this podcast, taking notes, and really looking within, because that's how growth happens. It's a willingness to take a look at yourself and develop some self-awareness. So today's episode, we are talking about all things healing emotional eating. Where do we begin? How does it even start? We talk about all the things. So let me introduce you to my guest. Diane Petrella has a master's in social work and holistic psychotherapist specializing in childhood trauma, emotional eating, and body confidence. Man, do we all need this episode. Early in her nearly 40-year career, she co-developed the first child abuse treatment program in Rhode Island. Diane has helped thousands of people overcome early trauma, create a respectful relationship with their body and food, and connect with their inner wise self for sustained healing. She is the author of Healing Emotional Eating for Trauma Survivors, Trauma-Informed Practices to Nurture a Peaceful Relationship with Your Emotions, Body, and Food. I found her book and I wanted to dive in because this topic isn't talked about enough, and we haven't talked about this topic on the podcast before because I've found an author to talk about it. And I found Diane and I was thrilled to connect with her. She has a very loving, compassionate heart, and you'll pick up on that during this episode. So listen to the whole episode, share it with somebody that you want to start this conversation with, and you guys can talk about emotional eating and healing together. Why don't we talk about vulnerable things? Because we're afraid of what other people will think. I'm telling you, once you start sharing this, you'll have the me too. I do this too. And then you can start sharing it and processing and talk about it together. So share this episode with somebody you might want to be on this healing journey with, and grab the free healing guide at Kristen, Kristen, Boyce, BOICE.com/free resources. And that will be emailed to your inbox and you can start your healing journey. It's never, ever too late. So here is my connective conversation with Diane Petrella. Welcome to this week's Close the Chapter podcast. This subject is one that I've wanted to talk about on the podcast for a long time. And I've been looking for someone to say, oh, this is my zone to really dive into this subject, emotional eating. And when I came across Diane's workbook, I thought, yay, I found the person that knows a lot about this and has written on the topic. So Diane, welcome to the Close the Chapter podcast.
Thank you very much, Kristen. I'm delighted to be here.
So tell us how you wrote the workbook, how it came to life to really talk about emotional eating for trauma survivors.
Yeah.
How did that start?
Well, it kind of goes back to the early years of my career, which is nearly 40 years at this point. So I've been a therapist for a long time. And I'm going to just very quickly give the background because it's connected. I first started working with children who were sexually abused. I co-developed the first child sexual abuse program in Rhode Island in the mid-'80s when sexual abuse was first starting to even be acknowledged as something that even happens, right? It was a long time ago and it wasn't really getting much attention, but it started to at that time. So from that work, I was originally trained as a child therapist. I no longer work with children now, only adults at this point. But it was during that work of working with children who were sexually abused and then adolescents and adults who were sexually abused as children. I also worked with offenders. I worked with all forms of abuse in addition. So it evolved into a practice where trauma was my primary focus. And during that time, I was working with a colleague who was a dietitian, and many people reached out to her for issues with weight. And she was a very astute dietitian and realized there's a lot more going on here than just giving my clients some information around nutrition or a diet plan or whatnot. So we began collaborating. And it was really then where it was very clear that people who struggled with emotional eating, and for some of them, they wanted to address weight issues. My approach is a very weight neutral approach. But it started from working with people who their priority was around issues with weight, but it was very clear that what was going on were trauma-based issues and how they were using food to comfort and soothe themselves and just trying to cope. It had nothing to do with finding the right food plan or willpower or being lazy. So I've been dealing with this issue for a very long time. And then it was over the past, takes a long time to birth a book. So I had ideas and whatnot for some time in formulating the book itself, which is there are a lot of practice steps in there for people to follow. But it just naturally evolved. This same colleague actually was somebody who worked with emotional eating, and I was writing some articles, blog articles for a website she was working with at the time, this nutritionist, dietitian friend. And then it evolved from that.
It is such a powerful workbook because you're helping people go inward and take a look at the emotions and process kind of what's underneath the looking to food for comfort. Because I have many, many clients that say, when I am triggered, when I am upset, when I'm stressed, when I'm overwhelmed, food is my comfort. So where does someone begin to start this healing journey, the relationship with food?
Well, I think one of the first things is to do the best they can for those listening, to release the shame, release the guilt. This is not your fault. Exhale into that. This has nothing to do with willpower. You're just doing the best you know from however long ago you learned to soothe and comfort yourself. And food may have been your go-to thing, for lack of a better word right now. I don't want to call it a drug, but for your go-to resource or whatnot, because you discovered somewhere along the way that it helped either distract you, it helped to calm your nervous system down when you may not even know that you're what's called when your body gets dysregulated. Many people, not everyone, but many people may have started using food to cope in childhood. As I mentioned, with working with children, I saw many kids and teens. One of the reasons why people may start using food as a coping mechanism, a coping process, a coping tool, trying to find the right word there, is because it's easily accessible when you're a kid. Granted, there are situations where people may experience food insecurity, and that's an additional problem. But when that's not the case, food is generally easy to access, whether that food is, those comfort kinds of foods or foods that people generally tend to turn to cope, or salty, fatty, sweets. Kids can find those pretty easily. And with maybe 50 cents, they could go and get a candy bar where you can't get cigarettes so easily, or you need a license to get alcohol unless people discover that helps them and it's in their family. But it's an easily accessible go-to resource, so to speak, to cope. And some kids and teens learn that early on. And so one of the first things to do is to do the best you can to release beating up on yourself, and also learn about how early trauma, when I say early trauma, childhood, adolescence, not only those younger ages, but to learn about how trauma affects one's nervous system. Because when kids are traumatized, especially when it's in their family and they're traumatized, or I should say abused by people who are supposed to take care of them, your lifelines, you don't have any really, unless you're able to reach out for support outside of your family or with extended family or neighbors. I also want to say that not all trauma is abuse, of course. People can experience trauma with a divorce or death or a parent who has a substance abuse problem or a depression issue or poverty is traumatic. So it's not always abuse. It's harder in many ways when it's abuse, especially when the abuse is committed, whether it's physical, sexual, or neglect, by people who are supposed to take care of you. But one thing people can do is to do your own research and learn how trauma affects the developing child's brain and nervous system in a way that makes the adult later and the child susceptible to stress. And there's a heightened stress response so that even as an adult, even for some people, even minor annoyances might feel bigger, may feel very stressful because their body is reacting, and we can't always control that. It's called dysregulation, when our bodies feel dysregulated, whether that's anxiety, a pit in the stomach, a kind of muscle tension, a sense of removal. The other word for that is dissociation, when you feel kind of detached, brain foggish. So there are a lot of ways that things happening in your life today may trigger the nervous system to react as if, in some ways, the same intensity of trauma is still happening, because even though time goes by, time has been said, time does not heal all wounds. The body encodes it and holds on to it, as well as your heart and the beliefs you have about yourself, the thoughts you have. Some people may be easily triggered to feel guilt, may be easily triggered to feel shame. The intensity of that, especially I'd say if those listening, if there are certain predominant feelings or thoughts about themselves that happen frequently, chances are it's rooted in something in childhood, not necessarily just about today. So doing some education around how their bodies may hold trauma. And then another thing, it's about doing the best one can to be with their feelings. And it's not always easy to do that when your body's dysregulated, but to do the best you can to notice what you're feeling. Now, obviously, I'm going to be saying things that I know is hard to do with just listening to somebody say, do this, do that. I get that. It can take a process of healing, but it's noticing when you're triggered or have an intense emotional reaction, where it is in your body. Is it your head? Is it your stomach? Is it back pain, perhaps? Is it a sinking feeling? And then give it a name. I feel sad, or I feel scared, or I feel guilty. Well, just by naming something. And in my book, there's a worksheet. My book comes with a link where people can download some worksheets as well as some audio guided imagery exercises and guided imagery, a process to connect with one's wise self, to connect with their body wisdom. There's also a worksheet of different feelings, and I break them down into 4 categories: sad, mad, glad, and scared, so that you can develop an awareness of a range of feelings to identify what it is you're experiencing in that moment. When we can give a name to a feeling, we're actually calling forth the thinking part of our brain. In a certain way, it can help us feel, even if it doesn't take away the intensity, it can help us feel just a little bit more grounded. Oh, that's it. I'm feeling scared, or I'm feeling angry. Just saying it can be helpful. And I add to that, when you can notice what you're feeling, when you can give it a name, tell yourself, and that's okay. I feel sad, and that's okay. I feel scared, and that's okay. For many people, it's giving themselves reassurance for hard feelings that they may have had when they were growing up and they didn't have the assurance or reassurance around it. Think of what it's like to say to a child who's upset, that's okay. I'm here. It'll be all right. Even if it's not all right in the moment, that's okay. Children need that reassurance. And the child or teen that you are, who's having a strong emotional reaction, needs you to let it know that it's okay to feel what they need to feel. It's not about pushing it away. It's letting it be. And I know that's easier said than done. Another process that I talk about in my book, so it's noticing the feeling, naming the feeling, accepting the feeling, and then what I call loving the feeling. And I talk about creating, and I do this with my clients. It's a fun exercise, a fun process where I suggest to people to create a self-care basket or a box, could be anything, but where you think of the things that you've used in the past, separate from food, that have helped you feel grounded, comforted, soothed, supported, and you put them all in an easily accessible place in a basket that you put in an easily accessible place in your home. And maybe there's a little basket you put in your car or a few things in your purse. And by those things, I mean, it could be those fidgets, things that you just put in your hands when you're feeling stressed or just need to grab at something. That can be very useful, or stones or whatnot. It could be a box of herbal tea to remind you to take a 10-minute soothing herbal tea break. And rather than keeping it in your pantry, you put it in your box. It could be a list of names of people to call so you can remember who to contact. It could be a book of prayers or affirmations. It could be just for a distraction, People magazine, something like that. I talk in my book about creating a sacred shawl, what I call a sacred shawl practice. And you either use a shawl or any kind of upper garment, could be a shirt or a light jacket that you put around you. And when you're feeling stressed, to wrap yourself in the shawl or shirt and give yourself a hug and just breathe. Breathing is a wonderful way to help calm the nervous system. I talk in my book about diaphragmatic breathing, which is basically belly breathing, breathing from the lower part of your lung so that you're taking full, deep breaths. That suggests people could learn about that as well, because when we breathe diaphragmatically, it can really help to, at least if it doesn't take the stress out of your body entirely, it can take the edge off of it. So when you breathe, you wrap yourself up in what I call a sacred shawl, because when I work with clients, we do a little prayer with their shawl, which is a way of enlisting the support of what I call their wise self, or whatever their higher power, God. And then you wrap yourself, you do a blessing, and then that's this garment that's blessed, and you're wrapping it around you. You're breathing, you're giving yourself a hug through self-compassion research. A hug from ourselves or a hug from other people can actually help to soothe ourselves too. And then when you're wrapping yourself in a garment where you've enlisted and infused it with the support of your wise self or higher power, you're not alone. You have your higher power with you to just help in that moment, to help you feel grounded and settled. And then I suggest if you have one of your shawl, and have many of them that are blessed, put them in the basket. So there could be all sorts of things that people choose to put in their basket. I'm a knitter, so I love little knitting projects. I always have several projects going on. So if people do handiwork, that's a great thing to put in your basket, because when you're focused on one thing, like a stitch or needlework, whatever it is, you're not focused on the thoughts you had that were triggered by whatever upsetting situation happened. Little jigsaw puzzle. Jigsaw puzzles are also a great way of focusing your mind away from stress-based thoughts and just to a project at hand that can also help ground the body. So in terms of what to do, that was a long-winded way of answering your question. That's a process people can learn about, and it's okay if it's not something, there's no one right way, successful way, but they're just knowing that you have some tools to use to be with your feelings in a way that you can welcome and acknowledge them without pushing them away. One of the things that happens when people turn to food to cope, and I also want to add, if you're upset and you use food to cope, all right, fine, so what? That's okay. Go to your basket. Use it to soothe yourself afterwards as well. No beating yourself up. This isn't about stopping a behavior necessarily entirely, and it may not go away, but it is about how you talk to yourself afterwards. Because one of the things that happens when people use food to cope is they then beat themselves up for it. This is so common. Guilt, shame, what's going to happen with my body if they're have some body insecurities and they're concerned about weight issues. And again, I do try to be very weight neutral, but I know that's still something people worry about, will beat themselves up about if they're eating to the point where their body's feeling uncomfortable. But actually, healing emotional eating, I talk about this in my book, a whole section on this. Healing emotional eating does not mean not emotionally eating anymore. It's really about how you handle it when you do emotionally eat. Are you going to beat yourself up mercilessly? Or are you going to love and support yourself like the child or teen you once were needed that love and support? It may not stop completely, and that is completely okay. The healing comes from giving yourself love, support, acceptance, self-compassion after overeating. And the more people do that, the more you're also healing from childhood trauma and those trauma-based negative beliefs of shame and guilt that are rooted often in childhood trauma. So it's not about not using food. It's how are you going to talk to yourself when you do. I hope all that's.
Yeah, that's so important. I think all of that, I love it so much. So let's put all this in practical use. Let's say someone's listening and they're like, oh, I love what Diane's saying. I really want to eat my chocolate. I really want to go in the pantry and eat my chips. I want to get my chocolate. I have this impulse. And let's put it in practical application. So we get our box out. Would that be your first step? What would be what do you feel? Like, what would be the first step for somebody? Identify their feeling.
Do the best you can to pause and breathe. Just focus on the breath. When you have the awareness that I want to grab something to eat, sometimes the awareness, it may be such an impulsive action that there isn't the ability to stop. And that's okay. You're learning something new, but do the best you can to just stop and breathe. One thing I'd like to add to this, and I talk about this in my book, is what's called the 90-second rule. I learned about this from Jill Bolte Taylor, who's a neuro.
I love Jill Bolte Taylor. My Stroke of Insight.
Yes. And she has a new book out now too, but My Stroke of Insight, this fabulous TED Talk she did, although she didn't talk about this in the TED Talk, I don't believe, but in her book. And this is when I first learned it and I've been teaching my clients. So she calls it the 90-second rule, or somebody coined that term. But when I learned this, it can be a game changer. So what I learned from her is it takes just about 90 seconds from when we're triggered, whether it's triggered to feel anger, whether it's triggered in a sinking feeling of shame, whatever the intense emotion might be. Physiologically, it takes just about 90 seconds for those stress hormones to course through our body, cortisol, adrenaline. But then after 90 seconds, it can pass. But what happens with human beings? We keep it going with those stress-based negative thoughts like, I can't believe she said that to me. I can't believe my boss wants me to stay late to do all this other work. I can't believe I haven't heard from them. Don't they like me anymore? They haven't texted me back. All those thoughts, we keep the stress going in our nervous system. And we're human beings. Of course, we're going to do this. Years ago, I remembered seeing or reading about or a video with Eckhart Tolle, and he was talking about, you're nodding, so I guess you.
Yes. Power of Now, New Earth, for those that are listening.
Yeah, I remembered him talking about or watching, I guess they were ducks, say, squawking at each other. Maybe one duck got the breadcrumb and the other one didn't. And they're squawking at each other. And then they just sail away. They're not holding on to anger. They're not saying, I can't believe he took that from me. Who do they think they are? Like animals, they don't do that. And I thought that was a powerful message of how human beings do that, because we do. That's just how our brains operate. But if we could be like ducks and go back to a place of neutral where we're letting go, at least to some degree, of those fear-based, trauma-based, negative-based, stress-based thoughts, we help our body go back to neutral, or at least take the intensity down a little bit. One way to do that is to learn to breathe diaphragmatically. And then one thing I talk about, well, actually, I'm not sure in the book or other places, but a simple breathing exercise is called 4-step breathing or box breathing. Think of like a 4-sided box. where you stop, pause, breathe. Remember the 90-second rule. Let me just calm myself for a minute and a half. Breathe in to the count of 4. Hold a breath to the count of 4. Exhale, 2, 3, 4. Hold the breath, 2, 3, 4. And repeat that for about a minute and a half, focusing on the breath. Now, it could be more breaths. I say 4. Too many sometimes might be hard for people, but do what works for you. But the goal is to pause and use the beauty of our breath to help settle our nervous system down, even if it's just a little bit. And our breath is so beautiful, right? It's always with us, and nobody needs to know what we're doing. So that's the first thing I'd suggest people do. And again, it is a practice. When you're in that trauma-based, dysregulated body space, it's not always that easy. I want to underscore that. That's okay. This isn't about perfection. It's about just practice. So that's the first thing I'd suggest. And then to notice what's happening in your body. What am I feeling? Do the best you can to name it. And then if you're home, yes, go to your box and just see what may resonate for like a 10-minute self-love, self-regrouping moment. And if you're somewhere else, see if is there someone you could call, or simply just breathing if you don't have your body, if you're at work and you don't have a go-to resource to use in that moment. But it's not always about doing something else besides eating. So much of this is about learning to be with our feelings without having to do anything, just being with them, breathing through them. And I also want to add that if you find that you're doing that and you just can't help yourself and you're getting something to eat, that's okay. Just no beating yourself up for it. It's a practice.
That's key. No beating yourself up over it. You're nurturing yourself, which is all children need. And many of us didn't get because our parents had their own life transitions or traumas or emotional neglect themselves. So we're giving our nervous system what we needed from our parent, which is nurturing,
exactly,
passion, empathy.
Right. And I'd like to add this too, that when people use food and they're emotionally eating, and to whatever degree, and they beat themselves up for it, what tends to happen then is that they lose sight of what was the original issue that caused them that upset. The focus sometimes then goes to, look how bad I am, or look at what I did. The focus goes on food, not that they're disregarding whatever it is that they might have been upset about, an argument with a friend or partner, or whatever it was, or not that they won't necessarily address that. But when you're primarily focusing on food and being upset with yourself for eating, you are moving away from a more mindful problem solving of whatever it is that you got triggered. So the problem then becomes food versus I need to set better boundaries, or I'm really sad. I'm grieving the loss of a relationship, or I'm lonely. Whatever it is that needs to be addressed, there's a little bit or a lot sometimes where the focus is moved away from that. So you're not really getting to a deeper healing. You're focusing on food and what a bad person I am and what's going to happen to my body and all these other kinds of stress-based negative thoughts having to do with turning to food versus what's going on underneath all of that you were triggered in the first place.
That is so important, because I think when we aren't dealing with the trigger, and now I'm in my shame and guilt over my eating the food or whatever, maybe I ate too much, or I said I wasn't going to eat that and then I did. Now I'm focused on that shame and feeling bad about that rather than what was initially going on, that what was I feeling, what was happening inside. It's almost like, do you feel like it's a form of, we could use two terms, distraction and dissociation. Dissociation, you mentioned at the very beginning, where you're kind of detached. You're not really connected to your body and what you're feeling.
It can be both.
Can you say a little more about that?
Yeah, it can be a way that, some of your listeners may have heard that term, quote, food coma. Again, there are degrees of using food to cope. And, most I'm not going to say everybody. I don't know. People cope in different ways, but many, many people use food to cope. It's really about degrees and how much of a pattern it is for people and whether or not there are other ways in your life that you cope with upset. For some people where they're consuming large amounts of food in a short period of time, it may feel very uncomfortable in their body and they're numbing themselves out. That term, as I said, food coma, and they may get into a somewhat dissociated state. They're just removed from what they're feeling. So from a minor distraction to a deeper dissociated state, that food may enhance that state or create it actually in some ways. It absolutely can do that. And I think it really depends on, for many people, how much they may be consuming and also what their tendency may be anyway to dissociate under stress. Now, dissociation is a defense mechanism that many people may use, certainly trauma survivors and abuse survivors, and certainly sexual abuse survivors. Dissociation is essentially when your mind is sort of removed. Some people that I've worked with have talked about when they've been physically or sexually abused, almost as if they're seeing themselves from the top of a ceiling, looking down at what's happening to them. And in some ways, I call it almost a miraculous coping mechanism as a way of helping people just get through a horrific situation. And then through chronic trauma, it can leave people in that just state of dissociation when they're under stress, maybe not to that extreme, but a kind of sense of removal from their emotions or from other people. And that's another form of when your body's dysregulated. So yeah, that can be one of the things that happens, either that prompts somebody to want to use food to cope when they're dissociated, or it can also create a level of that, depending on the degree to which eating as well.
I think that's an important part of the process. Do you? Noticing when you're leaving your body, you're leaving your emotion.
Yes, that's a practice as well. One of the other things I talk about in my book, and I have just a little scale to think about, to learn about your body and what is going on in your body at any period of time, not just when you're hungry or full or thirsty, although that's really important to learn to eat intuitively. And I'd like to speak to that in a moment, but to really know when you're hungry, to know when your body feels full, when it's had enough, to know when you're thirsty, just to know what your body needs. Another way to develop a sense of connectedness with your body when you've struggled with trauma-based dysregulation is to just notice. I have this 5-point scale. So for example, number 1, to notice that you're feeling calm and peaceful, or if you're feeling at ease. Or number 3, I feel a little unsettled. Or 4, tuning in, I feel very unsettled. Or 5, I feel overwhelmed. So to periodically during the day, and I have this scale, it's one of the printouts, it's in the book, to learn how your body just is, learn how you can be with your body, noticing what it's feeling like, to notice your nervous system. Maybe listeners can tune in right now. When they close their eyes or just gaze downward, perhaps tune into their body. Do they feel calm? Do they feel a little unsettled? Do they feel a lot unsettled? Do you feel overwhelmed or calm and peaceful? Just a simple 5-point scale. And I suggest that people tune into their bodies throughout the day to notice how their body's feeling. And if they're at a 3, a little unsettled, focus on your breath. That's an easy time to go from feeling a little unsettled to more at ease. If you're feeling very unsettled or overwhelmed, you can use your breath to settle yourself down a little bit, even if it doesn't bring it back to a place of calm or peaceful. But it's a 5-step tool to just tune in and notice what your nervous system is telling you at any particular time. And it's just very simple. It'll help people learn how their body's communicating stress and calm. And I want to go back to something I mentioned about intuitive eating, how when we learn to eat intuitively, one aspect of it, there are other points to this, but one is noticing when you're hungry, noticing when you're full. And many of the people I've worked with and people I hear from will say that they have a hard time developing and learning intuitive eating skills. And part of the reason for that is I want your listeners, for those who have experienced some form of childhood trauma, if it's hard for you to eat intuitively or to practice that intuitive eating approach, doesn't mean you can't. You can. But what may be getting in the way is your body dysregulation. So when your body's dysregulated, it's hard to know if you want to grab something from the pantry because you're hungry or because you're stressed. And it's almost as if those kinds of intuitive eating skills become inaccessible until people have learned to calm and soothe and ground their dysregulated body so they can be more what's called regulated to better be able to know what your body's really telling you. So I want to emphasize that because it doesn't mean you can't do quote unquote intuitive eating. It means that when you're traumatized, you just may not have access to the ability to do that yet. You can, but it's connecting emotional eating with a healing process, a trauma healing process. So you can get to that point.
I love that. Yeah, no, I think that's very helpful to share. What would you say? Because I know I could talk to you for hours. What has been the most impactful or helpful book for you in your life? Like one that just really kind of got you to maybe think or feel or open up in a specific way?
Actually, it's right here on my desk.
I love that.
Yeah. I learned about these books, series of books by a woman named Sanaya Roman. It's not psychotherapy. It's not about that, but she channeled this guide, Oren. It's a very spiritually oriented book. And there was a trilogy. One is the one I have right here is Living with Joy. I don't know the order of these. Another one was Personal Power Through Awareness. And then just Spiritual Growth. Maybe that was the first one. These were in the 80s and they resonated with me because sadly, I learned she passed away just a couple years ago, but she channeled this guide and all of that stuff makes sense to me. I know maybe some listeners may not understand that, but that's my orientation. In fact, my book is very spiritually oriented. By spiritual, I mean, it's not a religious orientation, but connecting with your intuition or your wise self or your higher self. I have an audio recording in my book that they can a free download where they can go through this process of connecting because I love being a psychotherapist. I love the work I do. And obviously I've had a lot of training and experience and workshops in psychotherapy practices. But I have to say, the main thing that allowed me to be what I feel is the kind of therapist I am is developing my own spirituality. Books by Sanaya Roman chanting, her guide, Oren, were just amazing. She distills psychological processes, actually, in very simple, clear terms. I read this still. I'm showing this to you. It's a reference guide for me. Almost all of them. That has been the most impactful. And I also read Autobiography of a Yogi by Paramahansa Yogananda. But I would always suggest to people to start with, if they want to be on a spiritual path, Sanaya Roman's books, because the simplicity of it is just so beautiful.
Oh, thank you, Diane, for sharing that. This is the first guest that's mentioned any of those. I'm so glad you're sharing that with us. I want to check those out. I was like, oh, I want to read those.
They're really great. They're really great.
Yeah.
I can't tell. Like I said, it's always, and I read it and reread it and look at, there's just such wisdom. And honestly, this has really helped me be a better therapist. All of those, that whole process of, I've done workshops with them and with her. And there was a man she worked with at the time too. But anyway, it's powerful information.
Yes, I'm going to check them out for sure. So thank you so much. People listening, the listeners love what you're saying. And they're like, I want to know more about Diane and her books. I'm going to link your book in the show notes and where to find you, but tell them verbally where to find you and then tell them about the free offering you have.
Yeah.
If you want to come to be on your newsletter and get the freebie.
I welcome all listeners to go to my website, dianepetrella.com. That's Petrella. And you'll see that you can put your email address in, and I have a free Food and Body Freedom mini course, e-course, and you'll get some emails, and there's a free download with that as well. And it's about 5 trauma-informed practices to heal emotional eating. It's a distillation in a very condensed way, just 5 practices, a little taste of my book, and it gives you an idea, but it gives you some practices that you can put into place immediately and start moving on a journey of healing both early trauma as well as emotional eating. So I welcome anybody to reach out in any way, or certainly sign up on my eating mailing list and get that free mini course.
That is very generous to offer that. I mean, so thank you. So take advantage of that. If you really want to dive into this in a deeper way and really integrate this into your life, I encourage you, if you heard something, I would invite you to take at least one of the resources that you shared with us today and start it. Because it's one thing to listen to a podcast, and I just encourage everybody to hold compassion for yourself. We've had Dr. Kristen Neff on the podcast talking about self-compassion and using that practice with what Diane is teaching, and start noticing, what are you feeling? Notice it in your body. And if you've listened to the podcast, you know, I'm big into this on really nurturing yourself through those emotions and be able to sit with them and let them be what they are. Because when we shove them down, they just stay condensed in the body, and your body will shut you down eventually. At some point, the body says, hey, listen to what I'm feeling. So thank you, Diane. Is there anything we did not cover that you wanted to mention before we close out our time together?
I think we did. I do just always like to underscore, as I said, healing emotional eating isn't about not emotionally eating. It's how you handle it when you do. Yeah, that's one of the most important things.
That's the big takeaway, I think.
Yeah, I could add, I have another resource in my book. Again, it's a free download to tune into your body wisdom, another tool to help you connect with your body, especially if people are struggling with body insecurity. This is a gentle, maybe 5 or 7 minute audio to help guide you to connect and just listen to what your body needs. And that's a practice too. If you don't hear anything right away, that's okay, but to keep tuning in. Maybe I'll share this, what I say in the audio. If people want to get quiet, tune inwards, and simply say or ask your body, what do you need from me today so that you will feel loved and well cared for? Just ask the question and let it go. Notice what you hear. When you first ask that question, you may not hear anything. You may not get a sense of anything, but over time, I could almost guarantee you will. It might be the whisper of an insight to rest, to go to bed early, to eat a certain food, to walk. Could be anything, or an image of seeing yourself do something. But our body's always trying to guide us and inform us about what it needs. So that's another tool that we have ourselves, just tuning in and asking.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Diane. Everyone, go out, get the workbook, and jump on Diane's site. I love how vulnerable you are, like sharing about you on your site. So everybody go read Diane's story. And thank you so much for the work you're doing in the world. I'm so grateful for you.
Thank you for your kind words, and thank you for having me. This has been wonderful. I've really enjoyed talking with you very much.
The feeling is mutual. Thank you so, so much. Thank you so much for listening to the Close the Chapter podcast. My hope is that you took home some actionable steps along with motivation, inspiration, and hope for making sustainable change in your life. If you enjoyed this episode, click the subscribe button to be sure to get the updated episodes every week, and share with a friend or a family member. For more information about how to get connected, visit Kristen, Kristen, Boyce, BOICE.com. Thanks, and have a great day.